Hello everyone, this is part 2 of my response to Irate Alex about pedophilia. If you haven't watched the previous part, where I cover these terms for example, I recommend watching that first. I guess you could also just pause this video and read these through if you feel like it. Once again, you'll find my sources in the description box. This will be a long one and I don't want to waste your time, so let's get going.
But no, I'm glad your channel was yeeted, and I'm very much glad that your video was also yeeted from the platform, because they were disgusting. They were promoting harm against children. They were promoting sexual abuse. I know you disagree. We don't care. That's a fact. All right? You breached the terms of service. You were promoting harm to children. End of discussion.
While I agree that Amos is unintentionally promoting harm and it deserves to be pointed out, I'm not sure trying to get him censored is the right call. Almost always when people disagree politically, the other side can say that those they oppose are promoting harm. As an example, if you believe in restrictions on gun rights, arguing guns are potentially dangerous, you could sincerely think that the pro-gun movement is promoting harm because you think guns are bad for society, right? So trying to get people banned on the grounds that they're promoting harm is kind of a slippery slope, since so many debates revolve around something that is perceived as dangerous or harmful by one side, as in the previous example. And even if you do manage to get the other side censored, you haven't won the debate, you've just silenced the opposition, which is not very democratic or admirable. Also, I could say that from my perspective, your position is harmful, Alex, because you effectively want to ostracize pedophiles, making it harder for them to get help, which endangers children. It's by the way funny how antis always talk about children's rights and welfare, and yet they don't seem able to figure this out no matter what. It's almost as if it's not about children for them, but something else. Anyway, I'll still not try to get you banned from the platform. I'm trying to engage with you, and this is probably how we should deal with everyone, regardless of their views, whether they are racist, homophobes, or even people thinking it's okay to have sex with children. Maybe I'm just a naive cunt, but I really believe in dialogue, and I see nothing to celebrate in censorship.
And let me ask you this, Maps people. Let me ask you this, pedophiles. Right? What happens when you're together in a relationship, quote unquote, again, and that child then grows out of your desired range of what you're attracted to? What happens if you manage to succeed and be in that relationship for 5 or 6 years, and then that child grows up into being a teenager? Are you going to stay with that? Are you going to stay with the kid? Are you?
While I'm not a pedophile, nor do I agree with sexual or romantic relations between adults and children, I just want to point out that most people have an age range that they're attracted to the most. So it's not solely a pedophile thing. In fact, if you don't have a preferred age range, that would mean you're literally attracted to kids, because you don't differentiate between age groups. While there might be people who are like that, that's not usually the case. So your question is not only relevant for pedophiles. You could ask a regular person, what are they gonna do when their partner becomes old and wrinkled? Admittedly, we do see old couples now and then, but it hardly has to imply gerontophilia, that is, primary attraction to the elderly. This demonstrates that sometimes a relationship can last, even when the partners move outside each other's preferred age range. That being said, I still disagree with sexual or romantic child-adult relations.
They're latching on a movement that is currently, finally, seeing acceptance, which makes them snakes.
Shu is correct. They have been trying to infiltrate the LGBTQIA community for a few years now.
When Alex uses the term infiltrate, he's using loaded language. This choice of words implies an insincere motive, which he doesn't prove. This boils down to the point I made in the previous video, that it's problematic to just assume people's motives. That's why I also have a problem when people throw the accusation of virtue signaling all over the place, for example in the topic of veganism or climate activism. Further, saying pedos are trying to infiltrate the LGBT is an accusation people might just as well use against any sexual minority that has joined the movement at some later point. Do you also think trans people infiltrated the LGBT because they weren't always part of it either? Indeed, what about this habit of continuously adding letters to the LGBT sign to make it more inclusive? Would you say all of these added letters represent infiltration, or just some?
And there is nothing more offensive in my mind to the entirety of the gay community than this idea. It's not as if, 50 years ago, 50, 60 years ago, that homosexuals were arrested for being gay. Pedophiles trying to get in on the LGBT rainbow there are effectively insulting the sacrifices made by those who have fought for gay rights for a very, very, very long time.
I'm afraid someone smarter than me will have to explain in the comments how the fact that gays were once arrested for being gay means that pedophiles seeking acceptance through the LGBT is an offense to the gay community. Like, were they pedophiles who were arresting gays in the past? What's going on here? Does someone really get where he's going with this?
LGBT people have had to deal with many, many people in society, politicians and so on, for the last 40, 50, 60, 70, even 80 years of being accused of being pedophiles themselves, when they're not. Gay men are attracted to other gay men. They're not attracted to children.
Alex's newly stirred sympathy for the importance of denotation of terms such as gay would be so much more convincing if he would extend the same courtesy to pedophiles and not mislabel them as child molesters once every few sentences. But it's true, homophobes often endeavor to make an association between gays and pedophiles as a means to attack the former. But this is hardly a cogent argument, because you might as well say that since gays were accused of being transvestites in the past, real transvestites should never be allowed anywhere near the LGBT umbrella. In fact, there are actual gays who think the LGBT should never have accepted trans people, maintaining that the trans ideology is a real threat to gays, and that the trans folks effectively drag gays down. Sorry for the bad pun. One movement formed by such gays is called LGBT Alliance. You can read more about that by following the link in the description. Look, I'm sympathetic to the real problem of gays being attacked with pedophile accusations. That shit is not right, so it's understandable why gays would want to distance themselves from all pedophile activism. No mystery there. At the end of the day, I'd still argue that if you truly believe in inclusion, human rights and social fairness, which LGBT activists claim to espouse, it should never be about throwing other sexual minorities under the bus to save your own ass. Also, why should we let homophobes' insults effectively dictate which sexual minorities we should or should not accept? Whether Alex realizes it or not, his comments are actually in a sense legitimizing homophobic rhetoric.
Again, LGBT rights, LGBT acceptance is for consenting people who are acting within the confines of the law, not for you dirty, creepy bastards.
Okay, let's go by these standards then. If we consider the existence of non-offending pedophiles, we must conclude that there's no problem consent-wise or legally with such individuals. By definition, non-offending pedophile neither violates the law nor anyone's consent. If a pedophile engages in a fantasy that requires no more consent from anyone than if someone decides to play a violent video game, nor is it against the law because fantasizing is not a crime. Now, if you disagree with the existence of non-offending pedophiles, that's another conversation then, but at least Alex has conceded in his videos that they exist. So basically it boils down to whether you are capable of admitting variation within pedophiles and apply due judgment given the subgroup, whether they are wrongdoers or not. I always think of this as a kind of an IQ test, really. To conclude, by Alex's own standards, non-offending pedophiles should be allowed to join the LGBT, because there's no problem legally or consent-wise.
Pedosexual maps, that is never going to be a thing, because we will never ever allow it. Again, because it's not a sexuality, but sexuality is defined as being attracted to a member of the same or opposite gender. You're attracted to age groups.
Now, I already explained in part 1 why pedophilia can be viewed as a sexuality, but I just want to point out something. Earlier in this video, you say this.
Trans isn't really a sexuality, but it is a part of LGBT, and of course they can be gay or straight or bisexual themselves.
So, shouldn't you also have a problem with transgenderism then, since you don't think it's a sexuality? And don't even think about moving goalposts by responding with something like, it's completely different, they don't hurt children. In the clip, you explicitly said that your problem with maps is that it's not a sexuality, did you not? So, all I'm wondering is if you're consistent, and also disapprove of trans people for the exact same reason. As much as I disagree with bigotry, I have at least somewhat more respect for bigots who are consistent in their bigotry than the ones who are not, if that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to add something really random and spontaneous. I really hate those rain sounds. It's been 3 weeks straight, clear weather, and then when I finally get to recording this video, this rain starts. Those are the sounds of the raindrops hitting the window in the background, so sorry about that.
Pedophiles can't control what age group they're attracted to because they were born broken. They were born with something very, very wrong in their heads. Very, very wrong.
What Alex probably means to say is that pedophilia is a disorder. Well, also gender dysphoria, that often accompanies transgenderism, is a diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's the same manual that also has a diagnosis called pedophilic disorder, but more of that in just a bit. It's true that gender dysphoria was used to be called gender identity disorder, so it technically doesn't have the word disorder in it anymore. Nevertheless, it's still in the manual, though some activists disagree with that, and as a problem for these people requires treatment such as hormonal or surgical aid. And this isn't me being insensitive or transphobic, it's just defined that way by the DSM, and as such, real insensitive factors like Alex could say it's brokenness. Why am I pointing this out then, and perhaps risking to come across as someone who has a problem with trans folk? Well, only to show Alex's reasoning fails again, because it so happens that trans people are included in the LGBT, despite their diagnosis. Now, someone could be really nitpicky and say that the diagnosis doesn't have the word disorder anymore, like I said. Yeah, but it had until 2013, and it obviously wasn't a reason for gays in the LGBT to denounce or exclude trans people. And speaking of gays, also homosexuality used to be a disorder. In 1973, the weight of empirical data, coupled with changing social norms and development of a politically active gay community in the United States, led the board of directors of the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. What should be noted is that the modern LGBT movement goes somewhat further back than 1973, and obviously there was gay activism long before that. To be more specific, the so-called Stonewall Riots, after a police raid to a gay bar in New York in 1969, can be said to mark the beginning of the modern LGBT rights movement, and the first gay pride march in the USA took place only a year after. You probably can see where I'm going with this, so all of this happened when homosexuality was still considered a disorder. How can Alex think the LGBT is only for those who are not broken, when it was conceived for fuck's sake by people considered ill in those times? But even if we ignore all that was just said about trans folks and gays, Alex manages to still be wrong because pedophilia per se is not a disorder. It really just means primary sexual attraction to children, and it only manifests as a disorder when accompanied by other factors. So think of pedophilia as a hypernym, or an umbrella term, and pedophilic disorder as a subcategory, that is, a type of pedophilia. The following excerpt from this 2015 study does great job elucidating this tricky concept. Pedophilia is defined as an ongoing sexual attraction toward prepubertal children. In the new DSM-5, pedophilia is depathologized by differentiating between the sexual preference for prepubescent children, i.e. pedophilia, and the disorder in case of additional factors. These factors include experiencing significant distress and impairment by fantasies and urges, or the acting out on behavioral level including child pornography consumption and or committing hands-on child sexual abuse offenses. Now, this is hardly something we can fault Alex for not knowing, because, quite frankly, the distinction between pathological and non-pathological pedophilia is not exactly common knowledge. Even some researchers fail to grasp this, despite it being completely in line with diagnostic manuals, if you read them carefully enough.
I'm oppressed! I'm oppressed! Oh, stop oppressing me! Shut the fuck up. Shut the fuck up. Paedophiles themselves, non-offending pedos, aren't exactly oppressed, are they? I mean, yes, they can't act out on their urges. Fucking too right. Good, I'm glad. Don't act out on your urges, pedos, you're disgusting.
Saying non-offending pedophiles are not oppressed has got to be the silliest claim Alex has made thus far. Just to debunk an assertion so outrageously ignorant would be a reason alone for this response. It's often a tactic by bigots to assert there is no discrimination against whatever they are bigoted against and thus undermine all efforts to address the problem. For example, a homophobe might proclaim that since gays already have their marriage and adoption rights, they should quit complaining, as if that proved gays couldn't be discriminated against. But when you are an anti-pedophile and you resort to the same, it's just plain ridiculous. Just think about it on a very general level. If non-offending pedophiles face no problem whatsoever in our society, why are they not publicly open about it? It's as if things aren't exactly that rosy for them. Next, I'll elucidate this from three perspectives: legality, stigma, and language, showing non-offending pedophiles are most definitely oppressed. The word oppression often brings in mind an oppressive legislation that repressed some of the population without a valid justification. So the question is, are pedophiles treated fairly by the law? Of course, different countries have different legislations, so the answer depends on the country. Child molestation is criminal in virtually all countries, but this is not discrimination because there is a real justification, namely the need to protect children from harm. Then what about child porn? It's illegal as well in most places, so is that discrimination? Well, the link between harm to children and possession of child porn is somewhat less obvious than with contact offenses. I'm still not saying it's ethically okay, only that the link is not as well established. But let's say the link is there indirectly. In that case, the possession of child porn being illegal is not discrimination either. This is where it gets interesting. If the ethical problem inherent in this material is that its production involves children who are victimized, what if this aspect is removed? Is there a legit justification to ban fictional child porn, such as lolicon? Lolicon essentially means sexualized drawings of young girls, but the term can additionally be used to denote the consumer of such material. So we can say lolicon is sexualized drawings of young girls, or that lolicons are people who collect this content. Oddly enough, not all lolicons are pedophiles, but some definitely are. It turns out fictional child porn is illegal in quite a few places, as indicated by this map, where the countries in dark blue have legislations that don't differentiate between, say, lolicon and real child porn. These places include New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the Philippines, South Africa, South Korea, and the UK, where Alex is from. Further, in many countries, especially in these dark blue ones, people can get in serious trouble for owning a child sex doll. We've now hopefully established that if we have a law that restricts behavior, it has to be justified for it to be not considered oppressive or discriminatory. Is a law that essentially makes lines on a paper illegal justified, really? And before someone thinks this is a non-issue or irrelevant, like who cares about some pedos and their sick drawings and dolls, here's something to think. If we had a legislation that prohibited gay sex, most people would find that obnoxiously discriminatory, and for a good reason. That is, the legislation would be prohibiting certain people, gays, from expressing their sexuality in a perfectly ethical manner. By that I mean there's no victim. That's at least my standards for what's ethical. Applying the same logic, can we not say laws banning fictional child porn or child sex dolls are likewise discriminatory? I mean, they also prohibit certain people, pedos, from expressing their sexuality in an ethical way. There's no meaningful difference. Obviously, those rooting for the thought police disagree. They claim material such as lolicon or child sex dolls indirectly puts children at harm's way by making pedophiles more likely to act on their urges. But this speculation is completely without scientific basis. There's virtually no direct scientific data about the effects of lolicon or child sex dolls to begin with. We can nevertheless infer from studies about porn that the effect seems to be the opposite. That is, there's good reason to believe this type of material rather reduces sex crimes by allowing people a safe outlet, as indicated by this meta-study especially. The unjust legislation is only a part of the problem. Stigma also is a form of discrimination. This quite recent study conducted 2 surveys to investigate social distance and stereotypes people have concerning pedophiles. The first survey used a sample of roughly 800 German citizens whom the investigators had approached on the street. The second study used a sample of 201 online participants of various backgrounds. Now, you could point out that the respondents in Survey 1 at best only represent German attitudes, which would be correct. However, considering that Germany is one of the most progressive countries, also when it comes to treatment of pedophilia, the odds are, had they used people of any other nationality, the results would have showed even more stigma. Why is Germany progressive then? Well, as an example, they have anonymous help available for pedophiles in the form of what's called Project Dunkelfield. Basically, this is comparable to Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was even advertised for pedophiles in public places. That's progressive as fuck if you ask me, and I like it. Before we jump to the results, please note that in both surveys the respondents were specifically asked to give answers regarding non-offending pedophiles. By framing the questions thus, the researchers sought to minimize the risk that the respondents would actually give answers about child molesters. If you're confused as to why they are talking about alcoholism here, that's because these studies were structured so that they allowed a comparison of stigma regarding pedophilia with stigma regarding other conditions, such as alcoholism. Okay, let's look at the results. To save time, I highlight only some of the findings, but feel free to follow the link in the description and check out the study yourself. Even though the respondents in Survey 1 felt being an alcoholic is more of a choice than being a pedophile, still 29% saw that having a dominant sexual interest in children is something they chose. 39% felt that pedophiles should be incarcerated, that is, to be jailed or locked up in an institute against their will, again, even when they haven't offended. Only 7% thought that they could have a pedophile as their friend, and 10% said that they'd accept a pedophile in their neighborhood. Now, and this is my favorite, only 34% felt that they could ever talk to a pedophile. I kinda get it if you wouldn't talk to a Nazi or a communist or some other breed of extremist with whom you know there will be no common ground or a string you can both pull and achieve something together. But to not talk to someone just because they have a different sexuality, I think that's a little bit silly. And not just little, it's quite dumb really. In most cases, the study too yields even a bleaker picture, with, for instance, 48% of the respondents believing pedophilia is a choice, and 49% insisting to lock non-offending pedophiles up. Compare this to the 21%, which represents their willingness to incarcerate people with antisocial tendencies. Only 5% could befriend a pedophile, and 6% would allow them in their neighborhood. And finally, only 15% would ever talk to someone they know is a pedophile. Obviously, these are just some items the surveys covered, but they should suffice to prove the points. As a follow-up, it would make sense to expand on how stigma, even in the context of pedophiles, is counterproductive, something this study also points out. But as that would be off-topic considering the clip I'm responding to, and this video is going to be awfully long anyway, for now I'm content with having hopefully demonstrated that pedophiles are extremely stigmatized and minority. Lastly, as a bit of a language nerd, I want to briefly talk about discrimination through language. About 2 years ago, I made a visit to the main library of my city to find out how psychology textbooks covered pedophilia. A bit weird thing to do, but whatever. Disappointingly, and this isn't an exaggeration, all of the books that mentioned pedophile effectively defined the term as child molester. There should be no excuses why published works at the respected library get this so wrong. Imagine a young minor attracted person who is scared shitless over his condition. Surely he'd want to go somewhere to learn more about it, and what a better place for this than a library, he might innocently think. But when he gets there, all he learns is that he must be a child molester, because the books don't differentiate between these concepts. Hardly encouraging or comforting for this person, who can't even talk to anybody about it. Hopefully you can appreciate that this conflation of terms is a real problem, as language is an immensely powerful tool. Due to the term pedophile being so tainted, our contemporary society has no good category for people who are attracted to children, and whenever we remove categories like this, we also stunt thought. If you're familiar with George Orwell's novel 1984, you'll know that one of its themes is the manipulation of language. In the story, one of the agendas of the despotic party is the removal of words, concepts and categories from language to simplify thought and to ultimately make criticism against the party impossible. In linguistics, the idea that language affects our perception is known as linguistic relativity. The hypothesis of linguistic relativity, a part of relativism also known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the Whorf hypothesis, or Whorfianism, is a principle suggesting that the structure of a language affects the speaker's worldview or cognition, and thus people's perceptions are relative to their spoken language. You get the point. If we go by this hypothesis, when there is no conceptual room for non-offending pedophiles in our vocabulary, they might as well not exist for the most people, which is exactly the status quo mindset. This makes even addressing the whole problem difficult because you're forced to use defective language and people don't want to admit they've misused words for the entirety of their lives. There are actual people whom I've talked to over the years who have found it impossible to conceive the notion of a non-offending pedophile. They'd completely agree when you say you can be attracted to kids without acting on it, but for them, these people wouldn't be pedophiles, because for them, a pedophile is always and intrinsically an offender. There's a little irony here too. The people who most protest attempts to fix this issue through the introduction of a neutral term such as MAP are the very antis whose careless use of language has raised the need for such term in the first place. But can we say our defective language represents discrimination against pedophiles? I would argue yes, in the same way as systemic racism is discrimination without necessarily being intentional. Sorry, that was a long-ass response to a specific comment. Moving on.
Gays and transgender people have already gotten much of their rights all throughout the world. I think it's time for pedophiles to have their turn.
God, he's so smug.
Oh, I think it's time for the pedophiles. Woo!
No. We shall continue to stigmatize you, and I truly, honestly hope that pedophiles never get any rights to anything.
So pedophiles are oppressed now? I thought your point was they aren't. And what do you mean by no rights to anything? They literally should have no rights, none. Like they shouldn't have the right to vote, drive cars, breathe oxygen, have the cells in their bodies replicate. Maybe clarify a bit what the hell you are talking about.
You simply have the sexual attraction and you don't act on it. Even more so, you should not condemn it.
Yes, we should continue to condemn the act, condemn the feeling. I don't want the stigma removed. I want non-offending paedophiles to feel like that if they were to ever act out on any of their desires, whether it's watching CP or doing it IRL with an actual kid, I want them to know that if they did that, I want them to fear society. Deterrence, people. Deterrence. We have that word for a reason.
Okay, for once Alex is actually trying to formulate an argument of some sort, instead of just vaguely asserting shit. It's an argument that antis use every now and then. The reasoning appears to be that we should have stigma against pedophiles so that they are less likely to offend, because they know that if they do so, they will be exposed as pedophiles and will have to face society's stigma, and obviously no one wants to be stigmatized. This might seem perfectly valid reasoning, but it's not really. Even if we disregard the fact that about half of child molesters aren't even pedophiles. Of course, they would be considered as such by most people, because many people are kinda clueless, so whatever, it's neither here or there. The real issue with this argument is that it's completely superfluous. Think about it, if we want social deterrence against anyone molesting children or possessing child porn, why not just have stigma against these crimes, and people who are guilty of these crimes? Just like you don't need stigma against kleptomaniacs to prevent stealing, since all you need is stigma against thieves. Because the stigma would naturally also deter kleptomaniacs, because if they steal, guess what? They become thieves. Likewise, having stigma only against molestation and child porn should create the exact same deterrence for pedophiles to not commit these crimes. Further, it's not only sufficient, it's also sensible and fair. If a pedophile molests a child, the real moral crime is not him being pedophile, really. The moral crime is he just raped a child. Why unnecessarily judge him for a thought crime when we could judge him for a real one?
Yet even with people who don't even act on their urges and simply have the desire that they control, you still have a problem with it.
Yeah, of course we do. Why wouldn't we have a problem with it? They're attracted to kids. There's a very good chance that they might act out on those urges. And the thing is, those urges are extremely dangerous. If they act out on it, they could completely destroy someone's entire life.
It's true that pedophilia can be a problematic trait, as pedophiles have fewer ethical outlets. In spite of that, in my opinion, people generally exaggerate the danger of pedophiles in this kind of a black and white way that leaves no room for nuance and exceptions. While it's surely more essential for a pedophile to have good morals and impulse control than it's for telephiles, it's not like only pedophiles need morals or self-control. For instance, take single telephile males who don't do one-night stands. They don't have a sexual partner available to them either, making their situation sort of analogous to that of pedophiles, and yet we don't expect them to go crazy and start raping people. Now, you might make the objection that telephiles can always resort to prostitution to get sexual release. For the sake of the argument, let's agree that first, there are no legal or ethical problems involved in prostitution. Second, all single males who have problems getting laid would be okay with prostitution, that is, they wouldn't find it embarrassing or something. Third, all pedophiles are exclusively attracted to kids, meaning they can't in any measure or form benefit from prostitution services. Even if we grant all this, the problem is that now you're implying that if it weren't for prostitution, all single telephile males without sexual partners would be dangerous to either men or women. This is quite an extreme position and one disputed by most males for sure, probably even by Alex when presented like this. Besides, it's not like we can't find any real-world examples of telephile males who neither have a sexual partner nor use prostitution and still aren't sexual predators or people who pose an immediate threat. This demonstrates that many people can live without sex while not being an active danger to anyone. Obviously, if we allow traits such as self-control and morals to pedophiles, we probably shouldn't, at least by default, deny their function in pedophiles either. What I just argued should suffice as a response also to the next clip, where Alex again implies pedophiles are dangerous. That being said, I'm thinking of possibly making a video about this in the future, because the topic is rather complicated and deserves to be covered in much more depth than I had time to discuss here.
This isn't like owning a rifle, where people might look at that person and go, oh, he could be a danger to society. No, the thing is, most gun owners are perfectly safe, responsible gun owners.
As opposed to pedophiles, I guess, who are all dangerous and irresponsible. Alex seems to think there's some kind of a weird inverse relationship between responsibility as a character trait and pedophilia, that the younger you're attracted to, the less responsible you somehow magically become. By this logic, the most responsible people of all would be those who are into grannies, that is, gerontophiles. This is just absolute nonsense. Moving on.
But the thing is, that's sexual urges. And many paedophiles in their time have proven that they can't control their urges.
To be honest, you can say the exact same thing about telephile males or gun owners. It's not like males never rape women or gun owners never shoot anyone.
Also, most maps don't act. Separating behavior from attraction is essential. It is generally assumed... What? What do you mean it's essential? The behavior is a result of the attraction. Come on.
Okay, hardly anyone disagrees that pedophilia is a motivation in many cases of child molestation, and it needs to be taken seriously. The guy's point arguably was that human beings can generally regulate their impulses and behavior. This example is a bit vulgar, sorry, but taking shit is also something motivated by your impulse. I don't know about Alex, but if you're civilized in the slightest, even if you feel the need to take a dump, you don't shit your pants when there are no toilets around. You wait. You control yourself, because as human beings we are capable of that. The fact that we can't always have what we want at any given moment and therefore must have restraint is such a rudimentary thing to learn in life that if Alex doesn't get this, what hope is there for this guy?
Minor attracted persons often show a desire to protect children. No, they don't. And make them happy. No, they don't. No, they don't. What they're actually showing is physical, sexual, and romantic desire to be with a child, and they want to have sex with them, and that itself is extremely dangerous and sexual abuse.
So apparently the standard here is that we're supposed to pay close attention to Alex's studies, while he can dismiss anyone else's if they disagree with him, as if science is only worth anything if it confirms his position. Look, if some anti-pedophile, for example, watching this, has studies that challenge anything I've said, I'd absolutely love to take a look at that research, because I'd much more prefer to be mistaken and then change my views than be some stubborn cunt with glaring confirmation bias.
Everything that I have said in this video can be backed up by sources that I will be providing links in the description, so make sure you guys go check those out. Although I'm sure Amos Yee and the Pedo Brigade will ignore those sources.
I'm not sure about that. It seems you literally have one source regarding pedophilia. The rest are links to the effects of child molestation. By now you should know they are different things. And even this one article is not a legitimate source. It's neither a study nor is it based on any studies. It's just a fear-mongering opinion piece by some religious news media. So just understand, this evidently biased article is supposed to back up all Alex has said about pedophiles. Yeah, sure it does. I'm even going to link this article in my description box, so you can confirm yourself how useless Alex's only source on pedophilia is. To wrap all this up, my most general criticism of Alex is that when it comes to pedophilia explicitly, he tends to just make assertions without backing them up with anything called evidence, science, or reasoning. There are exceptions though, like when Alex argued for why we should stigmatize pedophiles. While I ended up disagreeing with him, at least he made an effort there, which is good. But mostly it's him asserting something either directly or indirectly, such as that pedophiles are collectively dishonest or irresponsible, without providing sources or any reasoning, and thus ignoring his burden of proof. And obviously conflating pedophiles and child molesters doesn't help his case either, although granted at times he does seem aware of the distinction. Alex isn't even some low-hanging fruit, but arguably one of the best anti-pedos YouTube has, which is why I responded to him first. I plan to critique some other anti, such as Shoe and Head, next, and have a new video up every month. If you watched through all this, Alex, I'm impressed and I respect that. It shows you're willing to engage with opposing views. And I myself would prefer to conclude with something constructive, saying, for example, let's discuss this and try to reach a compromise. But genuinely, if your position is exactly the same as when you made these videos, our worldviews are so distinct that there will be no compromise. I will never approve a civilization where thought crime is a thing. Now, if you disagree with something, feel free to comment, leave me an email, or make a video response. I don't mind constructive criticism, and regardless how I may sound, I'm willing to refine my views if need be. And no matter on what side you are, I hope you're too. That's all I have. Thanks for listening.